Across America, many people are continuing to recover from the coronavirus pandemic and the effect that it's having, particularly in communities of color. Many people are still dealing with the challenges of racism. Protests are continuing to amass across America as America responds to the death of George Floyd. Well, in an effort to tackle some of these issues, the New York Urban League always sets its sights on dealing with racial inequity as well as equality. And guess what? Part of that discussion also includes talking about education, economic self-reliance, as well as equal respect of civil rights through programs, services, and advocacy. We're pleased now to be joined by the CEO and the president of the New York Urban League, Ms. Arva Rice, who joins us now. And Arva, we thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. And so let's get right at it. When we talk about where we are today, obviously, New York is still in this state of unrest. The nation is still in a state of unrest. We've got civil disobedience and peaceful protesting. I'll ask you the question first and foremost, what makes this protest and this situation just a little bit more different?
Mm-hmm. This moment in time is different for a couple of different reasons. First of all, we are just experiencing COVID. And so even if you were an essential worker, when you came home at the end of your hours on the job, you did not have a movie to go to. You could not go out to dinner. You could not even go visit a lot of the different relatives and family members. So as a result, you had a focus on the video that showed George Floyd and us watching it in a way that we have never had before. So it was a moment in time that we all shared. So that was the first thing that marked this moment as being very different. This was a moment where we had to look at our original disease. So we were already dealing with COVID, but then we had to look at the original disease of racism. The second thing that makes this moment in time very different is because we had people who were ready to take advantage of it. The fact is that particularly in New York State, that we have the majority in the Senate and that we also had the majority in the Assembly, that you had Senator Andrea Stewart Cousins and that you had Carl Heasties, that you were able to put together legislation, much of that legislation that had already been talked about, already been penned, already been inked, and was basically sitting in a drawer in the drawers of other legislators. They were able to pull it out and say, yes, we believe that chokehold should be illegal. And we wrote this legislation after Eric Garner and we were never able to get it passed. So here it is. Let's consider it right now. We've always thought that 50A was a law that needed to be abolished. We had the legislation here. Let's make it a part of this conversation. And so you had a group of individuals who were ready to take advantage of this moment. And then also you have the political will. The people who are marching, who are taking their times, being on the streets, that does make a difference. That does help to push the public discord. So I think it's the combination of those three things. The fact that we had nothing to focus on, but the fact that there was this man who had been literally murdered in real time on video camera and could not be denied, followed by two other killings, then having the people being prepared and the political outcry.
Yeah, and when we talk about this, I mean, we talk about the fact that George Floyd becomes really this new poster child for police brutality, but we've seen it before. We've heard the echoes before. I want to talk a little bit about not just the George Floyd incident, because when we talk about people being on the street, I think that there's a sentiment that people think that they're just protesting George Floyd. It's more than George Floyd. It is really about systemic injustice that has affected the African-American community for far too long. Talk to us a little bit about the imbalance in the criminal justice system, because we're talking not just about police brutality, but we're also talking about a reform in the criminal justice system altogether.
Mm-hmm. I think that your question hit the issue directly on the head. And the fact is that, we're not just marching for George Floyd, we're marching for Emmett Till, right? We're marching for Sean Bell, you're marching for Yusef Hawkins. And this is a long tradition of being treated as not having our lives matter. And so this moment in time, Black Lives Matter, is built on every movement beforehand. And so for a group of white people who has since early in their childhood been told that talking about race is impolite, that the best thing to do is to be colorblind, they're finally having to look in the face and say that if you're colorblind, you are not seeing me. And so if you don't see color, you're not seeing the discrimination and the racism that has been built into this system. And you saw Governor Cuomo say, you all have won. We have put together this terrific slate of legislation, and so you don't need to march anymore. And the protesters have come back and said, like you said, this is not just about this one person who passed, or even the 3 people that have come to light. Now we have the person who was just killed in Georgia as well. But this is about racism as an institution, and it is a referendum on racism.
When we look and we talk about racism as an institution, we know that one of the things that happened during the 60s was that of Black people being hung. And we know that that was real. We're hearing stories now, California, multiple people being found hung with the end result, suicide. Give me your thoughts on what we're hearing and what that takes you back to, and what can we continue to do?
I have to tell you, when I heard the first story about the lynching in Texas and the suicide, I mean, it's, first of all, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. That's not how Black people move and interact in the world. So the fact that you would even put that out as a possible solution to what had happened is just ridiculous. And it is chilling, absolutely chilling, to think about the fact that we could be back at that place and moment in time. The NAACP was created, the Urban League was created during that period of time where their lynchings were a regular, everyday occurrence. And so these civil rights organizations were created in order to count it. And so the NAACP counted every single day the number of lynchings that they heard about, in order so that they could count it and so that they could stop it. And so the fact that it would come back at this point in time, when I have my 4-year-old nephew and all the young people in the programs that we're serving, and brothers and cousins, and it's absolutely chilling.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's systemic. We've seen this throughout the course of time. You talked about the New York Urban League. Talk to us a little bit about the Urban League and the work that it does, because for somebody, they may not be so familiar with the work of the Urban League, but I know that every year we were take the report that was given and really break it down and be able to talk about some of the systemic things that are going on in our community. But would you share with our viewers a little bit about the work of the Urban League and the things that it does year round?
Sure, absolutely. So the New York Urban League is part of a national network of urban leagues that are in over 90 communities throughout the city. And urban leagues were started over 100, the National Urban League was started over 110 years ago, when, as I mentioned, lynchings were rampant, and African Americans were just being terrorized in the South. And so they became part of the Great Migration, moving to the North, moving into big cities, and trying to figure out how to acclimate to find places to send their kids to school, being able to find jobs, being able to find and to build communities. And so urban leagues were started in order to help those individuals who are making that great transition. And so over the course of the last 100 years, we have worked basically in the areas of education, employment, housing, and healthcare. And the New York Urban Leagues focuses particularly in education and employment. And by that, we mean education. We work with individuals in the middle school, high school, and all the way through, helping individuals get to and through college. And so in the middle school, it's providing STEM summer camps. It's being able to provide them with after-school enrichment. At the high school level, being able to provide college access. We have a huge historically Black college and university fair that's at Riverbank State Park, where we have individuals who are able to apply for college and get admission on the spot, and have given out over $1 million worth of scholarships at the HBCU fair on an annual basis. Then we work with those same individuals who are a part of our Whitney M. Young Scholarship Initiative, where we've given out over $20 million in scholarships there. And they're paired with our young professionals. And our young professionals are individuals who give back to the Urban League in amazing and wonderful ways, volunteering over 15,000 hours of service to the community, volunteering for that fair that I mentioned, as well as serving as mentors and providing support in our programming. And then we also provide individuals with employment, and that is providing them with opportunities to hone and develop their job training skills, job seeking skills, work on their resumes, and get placed in living wage employment. And then the last piece of the work that we do is in advocacy. And so when there are things that we feel like African Americans are not treated well, then that's when we speak out and are able to pull some of the levers of government in order to push for better policies and programming for African Americans. And you mentioned that State of Black America report, which is a report that our national organization releases every spring. And it talks about how African Americans are doing in some key areas in housing and education, employment, civic engagement, and also in criminal justice. And so this year, the New York Urban League will release our State of Black New York. And in the State of Black New York, we will talk about, that will be released next month. And we'll talk about some of the inequities that unfortunately still permeate our system. And the theme of this year's State of Black New York is inequality is unacceptable. And there's numbers of different points and places where we point to that inequality, but the one that is really runs through all of it is around economic inequality, which has also been the base of the Urban League's work for a long time. The NAACP has worked very hard on voting rights acts initially, and then the NAACP Legal Defense Fund continues to forward that work. The NAACP works a lot on legislation and works very hard in order to make sure that they're advocating for African Americans. And the New York Urban League works a lot in policy and also working in programming around economic justice issues and education.
Arva Rice is with us. She's the president and CEO of the New York Urban League, and talking a little bit about the work of the Urban League. I wonder if you will, let's tackle this topic, right? We talk about social justice, and many times when people think about social justice, the first thing that they always talk about is police brutality and the end of police brutality and the criminal justice system. But as you just shared, a variety of different things that we've talked about: education, we talk about housing discrimination, we talk about voting. These are all things and components that are tied to social justice. Can you do us some justice by giving us a little bit about what that social justice umbrella is from your perspective? Because as we said, to me, I mean, I know a lot of people say, oh, well, gosh, they're fighting for social justice and that's against police brutality. I'm like, you kind of got it, but you don't have it all together, because it's a whole lot more than just police brutality.
Oh, absolutely. So when we talk about social justice, it is criminal justice is part of that package, but it is about providing people with true equality. And that's the reason why people are still marching, right? So it's fantastic that we put together this slate of legislation. As I mentioned, that Governor Cuomo put the Say Their Name reform legislation into place that specifically focuses on some of the issues that we had around police brutality and around how police work with communities. But the fact is that if you're really talking about social justice, think of the word social, right? And then social justice has a larger umbrella of talking about how African Americans are treated in education, closing outcomes there. We still have great economic dividers. As an African American woman, you make 62 cents on a dollar, and so closing that income inequality, that's part of social justice, right? And so it is a combination of different aspects. When it comes to housing, it's still harder for African Americans to get mortgages. We still suffer from having lower credit scores and higher debt, and that is a result of systematic racism over the course of time. People say slavery was so many years ago, but the fact is that Jim Crow laws were not that long ago. The more discrimination in mortgage lending was not that long ago, and then we still have to deal with the inequalities around equal pay. And so those are systematic things that are still in place right now, and that's why we have to continue the fight.
Yeah. And when we talk about voting, I think that's major, right? We got an election coming up in November. We've got COVID-19 that we're contending with, and there is a concern that whether or not we're going to see people really get out to vote. We know we talk about voting and the possibility of absentee ballots, and going forward, a lot of people could possibly vote absentee. Your thoughts, your concerns about this upcoming election, given the fact that we're in this heightened environment?
Mm-hmm. You know, I am very concerned about this upcoming election. I think that peeling back the onion on what has just taken place with the massive move around police reform, like I said, shows you the power of voting. Because the fact is that if we did not have the majorities at the statewide level, a lot of that marching would have been for naught, because we would not have been able to pass those bills. We're really excited about the legislation that's been introduced by Senators Cory Booker, Senator Kamala Harris, them looking for justice reform. But the fact is, they may be able to pass it by the House, but will they be able to pass it by the Senate? That's the reason why voting matters. And if there was ever a concrete example of why and how voting matters. It is this moment in time. And so without becoming too political, but I think that the vote that is coming up this November for the president is really truly one of the most important votes of our lifetime. And we always say that. We said that 4 years ago and 4 years before that. But this really is such an important and crucial vote. We saw in Wisconsin that it was a tough moment for people to make a decision about their own personal health and take that risk in order to vote. And they stood on the lines, and the Wisconsinites voted. And so that is what we all need to be doing this fall. It does scare me a little bit because we're not sure where we're going to be with COVID. As we know, our seniors are an amazing, wonderful voting bloc, and that the fact is that they are still, commanded because of their health to stay home. We have to make sure that we're getting out information on absentee ballots and making sure that we have a commitment to not only vote ourselves, but I work with an organization called Higher Heights for America, which is dedicated to getting greater political participation by African American women. And so one of the things that they're pushing for is that not only you vote, but that you take 9 people with you to the polls. Now, the polls this year may be making sure that you turn in your absentee ballot, but we have to be dedicated not only to voting ourselves, but to making sure that we bring other people to that place.
Yeah. And getting the young people out to vote. I think that, that's going to be critical too. You talked about seniors, and you talked about how they're that very important voting block, and absentee ballots are really going to, be a big part of this year's election. But I want to go back to what you said a little earlier, because a little earlier you did say that, we talk about the presidential election being important. 4 years ago, people said, 56% of eligible American voters never showed up to the polls at all. 4 years ago, 56%. So when we look at this year, do you think that people get the message and that really people are taking action? I see us taking action and taking to the streets by way of protest, but do you think by way of the voting booth that people are really getting the message?
They're going to have to. They are going to have to. I am not sure if this level of engagement that is here in New York City has thousands and thousands of people pouring onto the streets and marching and chanting in a way that in my lifetime I've not seen, at least that intergenerationally in different races. And so we're going to have to take that energy into the polling boxes in November. And it is up to each of us, like I said, not only to vote as if our lives depended on it, and they do, but to make sure that we're taking 9 other people with us.
Yeah, I love how you said that. It's very politically correct. So I'm gonna go here and say, like, when we talk about going out to vote, right, or even coming out in this heightened season of protest, we're seeing numbers like never before. I think we've seen unprecedented numbers in terms of white allies, white support for Black Lives Matter, for social justice. And in the '60s, we didn't quite see that. This year, we see a totally different trend. More white allies, more people on the front line saying this is wrong. And I'm using white as the predominant demographic here, but we're seeing more. Why are we seeing more from your perspective in terms of that? I think it's welcome, it's needed, but what is really, do you think, is the determining factor in why we're seeing so many more people?
Mm-hmm. I do think that it starts with the fact that we were all watching at the same time. I think that in order to get America to look at its original disease of racism, we have to remember that it took a national, international pandemic in order to bring us here. So I think that's an important fact that we have to remember. It has been a great awakening, and I have gotten more phone calls from white people in the last 2 weeks than I probably have in the last 10 years. That has definitely been an awakening, but it is awakening that has happened because literally we had a pandemic that was, literally life stopping. So we had people stopping in their tracks. So that caused people to focus in a way that we had not seen before. Then you are seeing a person who is not struggling, even though that's I'm not saying that that's a good enough defense for somebody to say that anything else, but you had a person who was not struggling, and you could count for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. You had a man who called out for his mother, And everyone says that African American women all responded because they felt like that connection of a young boy calling out for his mom. I think a lot of white women felt that as well too. And
Yes,
so I think that is the particular circumstance of this death caught on film that battled against a lot of the negatives, the rebuttals that are sometimes put out there. They couldn't go with the rebuttals that they normally would, and we were all watching. And I think that that's what's brought this moment in time.
yeah. Arva Rice, President and CEO of the New York Urban League, our guest here. Thank you so much for taking the time and being with us. And certainly we will get people connected to the Urban League. Thanks for the great work that you're doing with Boots on the Ground.
Appreciate it. And I should let people know it's www.nyul.org.
All righty. Thanks a lot. We'll leave it there. Arva Rice. Listen, stay with us. We do have more show coming up. We'll be right back right after this.